My name is Harold Dunmore, and for most of my life, I was the kind of man people didn't notice until they needed something fixed. I ran Dunmore Auto Supply for 38 years, a shop my own father started with 2 bays and a hand-painted sign. I built it into something that fed 3 families besides my own. I was never the loudest man in a room. I let my work speak, and for a long time, that was enough. My wife Ellen used to say I had a gift for silence, that I could sit through an entire dinner and somehow still be the one everyone remembered afterward. She's been gone 3 years now. I still catch myself saving up things to tell her at the end of the day. Before, I remember there's no one on the other end of that conversation anymore. That Sunday started like most of our family gatherings did, with too much food and not enough chairs. My son Gregory and his wife Renee had driven in that morning, and the house still smelled like Ellen's old percolator, even though I'd switched to the drip machine years ago, out of habit more than preference. Gregory hugged me at the door the way he always did, quick and a little stiff, like he was checking a box. Renee's hug lasted longer, it always had. There was something in the way she held on an extra second that told me more about how she was doing than anything she ever said out loud. I noticed something was different about Gregory before I could have told you what it was. He kept checking his phone under the table, angling it away from Renee more than from me, which struck me as backwards, if you think about it. When I asked him how the business trip to Cincinnati had gone the week before, he answered too fast, the way a man does when he's already rehearsed the answer instead of remembering it. Fine, he said. Nothing exciting. You know how those conferences are. Well, I did know how those conferences were, actually, because I used to send him to them myself, and I couldn't for the life of me remember an auto parts distributor conference happening in Cincinnati in the middle of October. I let it go. Lee, that's something you learn after 60 years on this earth. Not every strange thing needs to be chased down right away. Some things settle on their own, and some things only get worse the more you poke at them, and you don't always know which is which until later. What I didn't let go of, though, were the 2 envelopes I found in my study drawer the week before, tucked behind my tax files where I wouldn't have noticed them if I hadn't been looking for an old receipt. Bank statements. Not mine, the business account, the one Gregory had taken over managing 2 years back, when my hands started giving me trouble with the paperwork. Numbers that didn't square with what he'd told me about our inventory costs. I hadn't said anything to anyone. I'd started a notebook instead, a kind of small spiral notepad you'd use for a grocery list, and I'd been quietly writing down dates and figures every time something didn't add up. I told myself I was probably wrong. I told myself Gregory had always been careful with money, ever since he was a boy saving up for a bicycle. But the notebook kept filling up anyway, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a door I didn't want to open had already started creaking. There'd been other things too, smaller ones. Twice that spring, I'd driven myself downtown without telling anyone where I was going, parked outside a modest brick building with Elliot Cho's name on the glass, and sat with my old friend for an hour going over paperwork I didn't fully explain even to him at first. Elliot had known me since we were both younger men with more hair and fewer aches. He didn't ask too many questions. He just said, "Whatever you need, Harold, and let me take my time getting to it." I told Renee and Gregory I'd been at the hardware store. It wasn't a lie I was proud of, but it was one I felt I needed, at least until I understood better what I was looking at. Dinner that Sunday was pleasant enough on the surface. Renee asked about my garden, which had mostly gone to seed since Ellen passed, since she'd always been the one with the patience for it. Gregory talked about the shop's numbers in a way that sounded rehearsed, upbeat in a manner that didn't quite match the tightness around his eyes. I remember watching him across the table, this boy I'd raised, now a grown man in his 40s, with Ellen's chin and my own stubborn streak, and feeling something I couldn't name yet. Not suspicion, exactly. Something closer to grief, the kind you feel before you've lost anything, like your body already knows what your mind hasn't caught up to. Somewhere between the pot roast and the pie, I felt a strange tightness gather behind my sternum, like someone had set a warm stone there, and it was slowly growing heavier. I didn't say anything at first. I've never been a man to make a fuss over my own discomfort, and I told myself it was heartburn, or the stress of things I hadn't sorted out yet. I reached for my water glass, and my hand didn't quite obey me the way it should have. Renee noticed before Gregory did. She always noticed things first. She asked if I was all right, and I remember trying to answer her, trying to form the words, "I'm fine," the same 2 words I'd been saying my whole life, whether they were true or not. But this time they wouldn't come out right. Last thing I remember clearly from the dining room table is the sound of a chair scraping back too fast, and Renee's voice going up half an octave as she said my name twice. Everything after that came to me in pieces, the way a dream does after you wake up and try to hold on to it before it slips away. I remember the ceiling of our hallway passing overhead at an angle that told me I was being carried or dragged, or maybe I was walking and just couldn't feel my own legs doing it. I remember Gregory's voice, tight and clipped, talking to someone on the phone, saying our address twice like he wasn't sure they'd heard him the first time. I remember the cold of the porch stepped through my shirt, Renee's hand gripping mine hard enough that I could feel her wedding ring pressing into my knuckles. The ambulance ride is mostly gone from my memory now. Just fragments. A strap across my chest, stranger's face close to mine, asking me questions I couldn't answer fast enough. A siren that sounded far away even though I knew it was right above me. What I do remember, clear as anything, is arriving at the emergency room and seeing the fluorescent lights slide by overhead in long white bars and hearing Gregory's voice again, this time not on the phone but close by, talking to a nurse at the admissions desk. I couldn't turn my head to see him. I could only listen. He gave them my name. He gave them my date of birth. And then, before the nurse could finish her next question, I heard him say something about needing to step out, something about an appointment he couldn't reschedule, something about being back as soon as he could. I want to be fair to him here because I've turned this moment over in my mind more times than I can count since, and I know grief and fear make people say things they don't mean. But what I heard, lying on that gurney with tubes already being taped to the back of my hand, was my own son telling a stranger in scrubs that he had somewhere more important to be than beside his father. Renee didn't leave right away. I remember that much. I remember her voice, smaller than his, asking if they shouldn't at least wait until a doctor had seen me. And I remember Gregory's answer, low and hurried, something about how there was nothing they could do just standing around, that they'd only be in the way. I couldn't see her face. I've wondered since whether she looked back at me before she walked out through those double doors, whether there was some part of her that wanted to stay and didn't know how to say so over her husband's certainty. I like to think there was. I have to believe there was, because the alternative is a harder thing to carry. And then for a while, there was no one. I don't say that to make you feel sorry for me. I've lived 71 years, and I've learned that self-pity is about the least useful thing a man can carry around with him. But I want you to understand what it felt like, lying in that curtained-off space with machines beeping numbers I didn't understand, listening to footsteps pass by outside the curtain without stopping, and realizing that the two people who'd come in with me had already gone. My chest still ached with that same heavy stone feeling, though someone had given me something that dulled the worst edge of it. My eyes were getting harder to keep open. And in that strange, foggy space between panic and exhaustion, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I found myself praying, not in words exactly, just a kind of wordless asking, the way you do when you're too tired to be embarrassed about needing help. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting in the plastic chair beside my gurney, the one Renee had been in not 30 minutes before. I hadn't heard her sit down. I don't know if she'd been there the whole time, waiting for someone else in her own life, some family member of her own tucked away behind another curtain in that maze of a hospital, or if she'd simply drifted over when she saw an old man alone with no one holding his hand. She was younger than my daughter would have been if Ellen and I had had one, dark-haired, wearing a jacket with a coffee stain near the cuff, that I noticed the way you notice small, unimportant things when your mind is trying to distract itself from something bigger. She didn't say anything grand. She just asked if I was okay, in the plain, unhurried way you'd ask a neighbor if they needed a hand with their groceries. I don't fully know what made me trust her. Maybe it was simply that there was no one else left to trust in that moment. Maybe it was something in her voice, steady in a way that Gregory's hadn't been in weeks. Whatever it was, I felt my hand move toward her before I'd fully decided to do it, and I felt my fingers close around the sleeve of that stained jacket like it was the last solid thing in the room. The sedative was pulling at me harder now, dragging the edges of everything soft and gray, and I knew I only had a few clear seconds left before I wouldn't be able to trust my own words anymore. I looked at this stranger, this woman whose name I didn't even know yet, and I understood with a clarity that surprised me that whatever I said next might be the only thing standing between the life I'd built and the version of it my son seemed determined to take apart in my absence. I want to tell you honestly that I don't remember choosing my words carefully. There wasn't time for that, and there wasn't enough of me left awake to be careful. What I remember is the feeling of her sleeve under my fingers, rough cotton against skin that had gone strangely numb, and the sense that if I let go of it, I might not get another chance to say what needed saying. So I held on, and I looked at her the best I could, through eyes that kept wanting to close, and I said the only sentence that felt like it mattered in that moment. Drive to my lawyer, I told her, before they get there first. She didn't pull away. I want you to understand how much that meant, because I'd have understood if she had. I was a stranger to her, an old man in a hospital gown gripping her sleeve and saying something that must have sounded at best confused and at worst like the ramblings of a man whose mind was already slipping. But she leaned in closer instead, and I remember the small furrow that appeared between her eyebrows, the kind of look a person gets when they've decided something matters even before they understand why. Your lawyer, she repeated, like she was making sure she'd heard me right. I nodded, or I think I did. My body wasn't answering to me the way it should have by then. I managed to get out a name, Elliot Cho, and something about an office on Maple, the kind of half-formed directions you give when your mind is already three-quarters gone. I don't know how much of it made sense coming out of my mouth. I only know that I felt an urgency I couldn't fully explain even to myself, a certainty rooted in months of quiet errands and a notebook full of numbers that didn't add up. Whatever protection I'd built for myself needed to reach Elliot before anyone else could interfere with it. I want to be honest with you about something else, too. In that moment, I wasn't entirely sure why it mattered so much. Why? I hadn't put all the pieces together yet, not the way I would later. I only knew the way you sometimes know things in your body before your mind can explain them, that time mattered, and that the woman in the coffee-stained jacket sitting beside me was, for reasons I couldn't have predicted an hour earlier, the only person in that hospital I trusted enough to ask. Okay, she said. Just that. No questions about why, no hesitation dressed up as concern, no suggestion that I should rest and not worry about it. Lee. Just that one small, steady word, and something in my chest loosened slightly, the stone easing just enough for me to take a fuller breath. I asked her name. I don't know why that felt important in that moment, but it did, some old habit of manners, refusing to let go even as the rest of me was slipping under. She told me it was Marisol Vega. She said she was there with her own mother, a few curtains down, waiting on test results of her own. I remember thinking, in the scattered way you think about things when you're fading, that it was strange how two people could end up seated beside each other for reasons that had nothing to do with one another and still end up mattering to each other's lives, the sedative one after that. I felt myself go under the way you feel yourself go underwater, a kind of soft, total surrender, sound turning distant and light turning to gray. The last thing I was aware of was her hand briefly, resting over mine where it still held her sleeve, as if to tell me she wasn't going anywhere until I let go on my own. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until days later, pieced together from Marisol herself and from Elliot's careful retelling, was what happened in the hours after I lost consciousness. Marisol didn't leave her mother's side right away. She waited until the nurse confirmed her mother's results were nothing serious, and only then, notebook page torn from her own purse with my scribbled directions on it, did she go looking for her car in the hospital garage. She told me later that she almost didn't go. She told me she sat in the driver's seat for a full 5 minutes, turning the key over in her hand, telling herself this wasn't her business, but she'd done a kind thing already just by staying with a frightened old man, and that driving across town to a stranger's lawyer's office was more than anyone could reasonably ask of her. But she went anyway. She told me she couldn't stop thinking about the look on my face when I said it, the particular kind of fear a man gets when he believes he's the only one who knows something is wrong. She said it reminded her of her own father, gone some years now, and the time she'd wished someone had listened to him a little harder before it was too late. She drove to Maple Street with my scrawled directions on the passenger seat, past the auto parts store I'd sold my working life into building, past the diner Ellen and I used to eat breakfast at every Sunday before church, and pulled up outside a modest brick building with Elliot Cho's name stenciled in gold on the glass door. What she didn't know yet, and what I certainly didn't know as I lay unconscious 2 miles away, was that Elliot had been half expecting a call like this one for months. He just hadn't known who would be the one to make it. Marisol told me later that she almost turned back twice before she made it through Elliot's front door. It was a Sunday evening, The kind of hour when most offices go dark and the parking lots empty out, and the building on Maple Street looked closed from the outside, just one light glowing behind a blind on the second floor. She said she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling foolish, wondering what exactly she planned to say to a lawyer she'd never met on behalf of a man whose last name she didn't even know yet. But she'd come this far, and something about the whole strange afternoon had settled into her like a task she couldn't set down, so she knocked. Elliot answered the door himself. He told me afterward that he'd been going over paperwork lately, the way he sometimes did when something was weighing on him, and that when he saw an unfamiliar young woman standing there looking uncertain, his first thought was that she had the wrong building. That changed the moment she said my name. Harold Dunmore, she told him. He's in the hospital. He asked me to come find you. He said something about needing to get here before someone else did. Elliot didn't ask her to explain herself twice. He told me later that a kind of cold clarity came over him in that moment, the feeling of a thing he'd been quietly preparing for finally arriving. He invited her in, sat her down, and asked her to tell him everything she could remember, every word I'd said, exactly as I'd said it. She repeated it as best she could, the collapse, the abandonment at the ER, the whispered instruction, the urgency in my voice, that she said she still couldn't quite shake even hours later. What Elliot didn't tell her that night, though he told me everything eventually, was that 4 months earlier I had sat in that same office and signed a new will. I had also signed, at his suggestion, a separate statement affirming my mental competency at the time of signing, notarized and witnessed by 2 people outside the family, precisely because Elliot and I both understood, without ever saying it outright, that someone might try to challenge my judgment someday, if they didn't like what that will said. I hadn't wanted to believe it would come to that. I'd told myself I was simply being careful. The way I'd always been careful with contracts and inventory and every other piece of paper that had ever crossed my desk in 38 years of running a business. But some part of me, the part that had been filling a spiral notebook with numbers that didn't add up, must have known better. Elliot moved fast that night, faster than I think even he expected to have to move. He called the hospital directly, losing his standing as my attorney of record, to confirm my condition and to make certain that no one, and he was careful, he told me later, not to name Gregory specifically when he said this, attempted to make decisions on my behalf without his knowledge. He pulled the locked drawer where my updated will and the competency statement were kept, made copies, and secured the original somewhere even more protected than before. He told me he didn't fully know yet what he was defending against. He only knew, from 30 years of practicing law and from knowing me as long as he had, that a man doesn't ask a stranger to drive across town to his lawyer unless something in his life has gone seriously wrong. While all of this was happening, I was still unconscious in a hospital bed 2 miles away, tubes in my arm, a monitor tracking a heartbeat I wasn't aware of having. I didn't know yet that my son had called Elliot's office earlier that same week, not once but twice, asking vague questions about how a family might handle decisions for an aging parent who was starting to struggle. I didn't know that Elliot had found those calls strange enough to mention them briefly to his assistant without quite being able to say why they troubled him. I didn't know any of it. I only knew somewhere in the fog of sedation that I had done the one thing I could still do for myself in that moment, and that whatever happened next was out of my hands entirely. Marisol stayed longer than she needed to. Elliot told me she asked, more than once, whether there was anything else she could do, whether I had anyone who should be called, whether she should go back to the hospital and sit with me until I woke. Lie. He told her gently that she'd already done more than most people would have, and that the rest was something he could handle from here. She left her phone number anyway, written on the back of a business card he handed her, in case I woke up asking for her. I didn't know that detail either. Not until days later, when I found that same card tucked into the pocket of the shirt I'd been wearing when they'd cut it off me in the emergency room, and understood that somewhere in this whole frightening evening, a stranger had decided I mattered enough to leave a way back to her. The days before all of this had a shape to them now, looking back, that I couldn't quite see while I was living through them. It's a strange thing about trouble. You can be standing right in the middle of it and still not recognize its outline until you've had some distance and quiet to study it properly. Lying in that hospital bed those first few days, drifting in and out under whatever they'd given me for the pain in my chest, I found myself turning over the months before my collapse the way you'd turn over a stone in a creek bed, looking at what had been hidden underneath the whole time. It started, I think, about a year and a half back, not long after Gregory took over managing the business account. My hands had started giving me trouble, arthritis. Mostly the kind that makes it hard to hold a pen steady long enough to sign a check without your signature, looking like a stranger wrote it. Gregory offered to take on the bookkeeping, and I was grateful. Honestly grateful, the way a tired man is grateful when someone offers to carry a load he's been carrying alone for too long. I trusted him with it, the way I'd trusted him with everything since he was old enough to sweep the floors of my shop after school, $1 an hour, and all the soda he could drink from the machine in the back. The first time something felt off, I almost missed it entirely. A withdrawal for equipment repair that I didn't remember approving, larger than it should have been for the kind of work it claimed to cover. I mentioned it to Gregory in passing, more curious than suspicious, and he had an answer ready fast, faster, looking back, than a man usually has an answer ready for a question he wasn't expecting. The compressor had needed more work than they'd first thought, he said. I let it go. A man builds a business over decades by trusting the people closest to him, and I wasn't about to start doubting my own son over one strange number on one statement. But the numbers kept coming every few weeks, small enough on their own to explain away, but adding up in a way that started to sit wrong with me the longer I paid attention. I started keeping the notebook without fully deciding to. It began as nothing more than a habit, a place to jot down a date and a figure when something didn't quite square with what I remembered approving. The same instinct that had kept my books balanced for 38 years without a bookkeeper's help. I told myself I was just being an old man who liked things orderly. I didn't let myself think much harder than that. Not at first. It was Ellen's old friend Dot who finally said something that cracked the door open wider than I wanted it to go. We were at church, of all places, and she mentioned, in the easy gossiping way of small towns, that her nephew worked at the bank downtown and had processed some unusually large transfers out of the Dunmore account over the past few months. She didn't mean anything by it, I don't think. Why? She was just making conversation, the kind widows and widowers make with each other after the service, filling the silence Ellen used to fill for me. But I went home that afternoon and sat with my notebook a long while, adding up figures I'd been collecting for months, and the total sitting there on the page was larger than I wanted to believe. I still didn't confront him. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I acted with more certainty than I actually felt at the time. I loved my son. I still do. Even now, even after everything. I told myself there might be an explanation I hadn't thought of. Some investment he was making quietly on the business's behalf. Some plan he intended to explain to me once it had paid off the way he hoped. I wanted more than I wanted to be right, to be wrong. But I wasn't willing to be foolish about it either. That's when I started making those quiet trips downtown to Elliot's office, telling Renee and Gregory I was headed to the hardware store, feeling a small guilty twist in my stomach every time I said it, because I'd never been a man who lied easily, not even about small things. Elliot listened to what I'd found without much reaction at first, the way a good lawyer does, letting me get all the way to the end of my worry before he said anything back. Then he asked me a question I've thought about many times since. He asked me what I was more afraid of, being wrong about my son, or being right and doing nothing about it. I didn't have an answer for him that day. But I went home, and I sat in Ellen's old chair by the window, the one she used to read in every evening, and I thought about the business my father had built with his own two hands, the one I'd spent my whole working life, growing into something that fed 3 families besides my own. I thought about what would happen to all of it, and to the people who depended on it if I let sentiment stand in the way of protecting it. I thought about Ellen and what she would have told me to do, and I already knew the answer, because she'd never once in 41 years of marriage told me to look away from a problem instead of facing it. I went back to Elliot's office the following week and told him I was ready to make the changes we'd been dancing around. It felt like a betrayal, if I'm honest, signing papers that would protect the business from my own son's hands without ever having said a word to him about my suspicions. But it also felt, in some quiet corner of myself I didn't examine too closely, like the most responsible thing I'd ever done. I kept the shop keys my father had given me the day he retired in the top drawer of my desk that whole time, the same drawer where I now kept the notebook, and some nights I'd take them out and hold them, thinking about the 2 men who'd carried that business before me, wondering what either of them would have done in my place. I came back to myself slowly, the way you surface from deep water, sound arriving before light, light arriving before I could make sense of any of it. The first thing I was aware of was a steady beeping somewhere to my right, and then a dull ache behind my ribs that told me, before I even opened my eyes, that whatever had happened to me had been serious. The second thing I became aware of was a voice, soft and unfamiliar, asking a nurse in the hallway if it would be all right for her to stay a little longer. When I finally got my eyes open, the light in the room was dim, that particular hospital dim they use for nighttime, and there in the chair beside my bed sat Marisol, the sleeve of her jacket still bearing that same coffee stain I remembered, gripping in what felt like a dream now, more than a memory. She noticed I was awake before I'd even fully registered it myself, and she leaned forward, careful not to startle me, and asked how I was feeling. I didn't have the strength for much of an answer at first. My throat was dry, my chest still carried that heavy, borrowed feeling, and my mind was working slower than I wanted it to. But I remember looking at her and feeling something settle in me that I hadn't expected to feel. A kind of relief that went beyond simple gratitude, the recognition that a stranger had stayed with me through a night my own family hadn't. I asked her, in a voice that came out rougher than I meant it to, whether she'd gone. She told me she had, and that Elliot had everything handled, and that she'd come back afterward, because she hadn't wanted me to wake up alone again. I don't mind telling you that something in my chest loosened at that, something that had nothing to do with the machines they had me hooked to. I thanked her the best I could manage, though it felt like far too small a word for what she'd done for a man she'd known less than a day. She waved it off, the way people do when they're uncomfortable being thanked, and told me she was just glad I was awake. I asked for her name again, to be sure I hadn't imagined it, and she told me again, patient with an old man's fog, Marisol Vega. I told her I wouldn't forget it this time. It wasn't long after that the door opened again, and this time it was Gregory. He came in with a kind of practiced ease that struck me wrong the moment I saw it, the ease of a man who has already decided how a conversation is going to go before he's walked into the room. He asked how I was feeling in a tone that sounded rehearsed, the same way his answer about Cincinnati had sounded rehearsed the week before, and he barely glanced at Marisol before pulling the second chair a little closer to my bed. He didn't ask who she was. That struck me too, though I didn't have the strength yet to think through why it bothered me the way it did. "You gave us quite a scare, Dad," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something too smooth, that made the ache in my chest feel sharper for a moment. I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, where he and Renee had gone the night before. He didn't flinch. He said something about an appointment that couldn't be moved, something vague about the business, and I noticed he didn't quite meet my eyes when he said it. I let it sit there between us without pushing, the way I'd learned to let things sit these past months. Watching instead of reacting, gathering rather than confronting. It didn't take him long to get to the real reason he'd come. He pulled a folder from his bag, said something about wanting to make sure everything was in order while I recovered, papers that needed my signature so the business wouldn't be left in limbo if my recovery took longer than expected. He said it lightly, like it was nothing more than a formality, the kind of thing any responsible son would think to bring. But I'd spent 38 years reading contracts before I signed them, and I could feel, even through the fog of pain medication, that there was something in the careful casualness of his voice that didn't sit right. I told him I wasn't ready to look at paperwork, not yet, not with my head still swimming the way it was. I watched something flicker across his face, frustration maybe, or something closer to fear, before he smoothed it back into that same practiced calm and said, "Of course, there was no rush. We could look at it whenever I was feeling stronger." But I noticed he didn't put the folder away. He set it on the little rolling table beside my bed, within easy reach, the way you'd leave a door propped open in case someone changed their mind. Marisol had gone quiet during all of this, watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood. She was witnessing something that wasn't entirely about a father and son catching up after a scare. When Gregory finally stood to leave, promising to check back the next day, he glanced at her one more time, a flicker of something calculating in his eyes, and asked, almost as an afterthought, how exactly she and I knew each other. I answered before she had to. I told him she was a friend. It wasn't the whole truth, not yet, but it wasn't a lie either, not anymore. He nodded slowly, said it was nice that I'd made a friend at the hospital, and left with that folder still sitting on the table beside me, close enough that I could read the top line without even reaching for it. It was a request for temporary financial power of attorney dated 2 days before my collapse. It was Renee who came the next afternoon alone, without Gregory, and I knew the moment she walked through the door that something in her had shifted since the last time I'd seen her. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that settles into a person's shoulders when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long without anywhere to set it down. She hesitated just inside the doorway, glancing at the empty chair Marisol had occupied the day before. Before finally coming to sit beside my bed, she asked how I was feeling, and I told her honestly, better than I had been, though the ache in my chest still made itself known if I moved too quickly. There was a long quiet after that, the kind of silence that isn't empty, so much as full of things neither person has decided how to say yet. I let it sit. I'd learned these past months that people tell you more when you give them room to fill the silence themselves rather than crowding it with questions. It was Renee who finally broke it. "I wanted to stay," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. "At the hospital. I want you to know that." I told her I believed her. I did too, more than I might have a few months earlier, back before I'd started paying closer attention to the small differences between the two of them, the way Gregory moved through a room like he already knew the outcome, and Renee moved through it like she was still hoping for a better one. I asked her gently what had happened that night, why they'd left the way they had. She was quiet for a long moment, twisting her wedding ring the way people do when they're deciding how much truth a moment can hold. Then she told me, in a voice that cracked more than once along the way, that Gregory had been under pressure for months, pressure she hadn't fully understood herself until recently. An investment, she said. Something he'd put a significant amount of money into without telling her. At first, something that had gone badly wrong sometime over the summer. She said she'd found out by accident, going through mail that had come to the house by mistake, statements from an account she hadn't known existed. I felt something in my chest tighten that had nothing to do with my heart. I asked her, carefully, whether the money in that account had come from the business. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know for certain," she said, "but I think so. I think that's why he's been in such a hurry about the paperwork. I think he's trying to fix it before you find out, or before it gets any worse." I sat with that for a while, the pieces I'd been collecting for months finally settling into a shape I could see clearly even through the haze of pain medication and heartbreak. The withdrawals I'd tracked in my notebook. The evasive answer about Cincinnati. The folder left within easy reach on my hospital table, a request for financial power of attorney dated 2 days before I'd even collapsed, as though he'd been preparing for this moment before it happened rather than reacting to it after the fact. I asked Renee, as gently as I could manage, why she hadn't said something sooner. Her eyes filled and she looked down at her hands before she answered. "Because I kept hoping I was wrong," she said. "The same way you probably kept hoping you were wrong about whatever you noticed before all this happened. I didn't want it to be true. I still don't want it to be true. But I couldn't sit here and let you sign something without knowing why he was really asking." I reached over and took her hand, the one still twisting that ring, and told her that what she'd just done took more courage than she probably realized. I told her I'd noticed things too, months of things, and that I hadn't said anything either, for many of the same reasons she hadn't. We sat there together for a while after that, two people who loved the same difficult man in different ways, both of us finally done pretending we hadn't seen what we'd seen. Before she left, she told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought. The way people mention the most important detail last, because they're not sure how to lead with it. She said Gregory had been to Elliot Cho's office twice in the past month, though he'd never mentioned why, and that when she'd asked him about it, he'd brushed her off with the same vague, rehearsed answer he seemed to have ready for everything these days. I told her I already knew, though I didn't yet tell her the reason why, or what waited for him in that locked drawer at Elliot's office. There would be time for that. For now, It was enough to know that I wasn't the only one in this family who had finally stopped looking away. Elliot came to see me himself 2 days later, once the doctors had cleared me for longer visits and I was strong enough to sit upright without the room tilting on me. He came with a briefcase I recognized from years of watching him carry it into meetings, and a careful, measured expression that told me he had more to say than he was going to rush through. He pulled the second chair close, the same one Marisol and then Renee had sat in before him, and asked how I was feeling before he got to the reason he'd come. I told him I was ready to hear it, whatever it was. He laid it out for me plainly, the way he always had, going back to when we were younger men and he'd handled the paperwork for my very first small business loan. The will I'd signed 4 months earlier was secure, notarized, witnessed by 2 people with no connection to the family, exactly as we'd planned it. The competency statement I'd signed alongside it was equally secure, dated, and sworn, anticipating exactly the kind of challenge someone might try to bring if they didn't like what the will said. He told me that Gregory had called his office twice in the past month, both times asking careful, roundabout questions about what it would take to establish decision-making authority for an aging parent who was, in Gregory's words, starting to struggle. Elliot said he hadn't liked the calls at the time, though he hadn't been able to say exactly why until Marisol showed up at his door with my whispered message. I asked him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, what exactly the new will said, since I found, sitting there, that I wanted to hear it back to myself as much as I wanted him to explain what he'd been protecting. He reminded me gently that the shop, the real estate it sat on, and the bulk of what I'd built over 38 years no longer passed automatically and entirely to Gregory, the way the old will had arranged it. Instead, it was held in a structure Elliot and I had built together, one that protected the business itself from being used as collateral or liquidated to cover someone else's private debts, one that required both Gregory and an independent trustee to agree before any major financial decision could be made regarding the company. It wasn't a punishment, Elliot reminded me, the way he'd reminded me back when I first signed it. It was a safeguard built by a father who loved his son enough to protect him from his own worst instincts, whatever those instincts turned out to be. He also told me something I hadn't expected. The temporary power of attorney Gregory had left on my hospital table, the one I still hadn't signed, would have given him significant control over the business accounts while I recovered. Enough, Elliot said carefully, to potentially move funds around in ways that would be very hard to trace or reverse once done. He didn't accuse Gregory outright of intending to hide the missing money that way. He didn't have to. We both understood what a folder like that, left within easy reach of a man 3 days out from a heart attack, could be used for if it had been signed. I felt something settle in me as Elliot spoke, something between grief and relief, the strange feeling of watching a fear you've carried quietly for months finally step out into the light where you can look at it directly instead of around it. I asked him what would happen now, whether Gregory would try to challenge any of it once he understood what he was up against. Elliot was honest with me, the way he'd always been honest with me, even when the truth was hard to hear. He said it was possible. He said men, under enough pressure, sometimes do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and that desperation had a way of making people believe their own justifications right up until the moment those justifications collapsed under them. But he also told me, and I believed him, that the paperwork was sound, that the notebook I'd kept for months gave clear documentation of the irregularities I'd noticed, and that between the two of us, we'd built something that could withstand whatever Gregory tried to throw at it. I thought about the shop keys sitting in my desk drawer at home, the ones my father had handed me the day he retired, the same drawer where I'd kept the notebook that had led us here. I thought about the 3 families who depended on that business besides my own, men and women who'd worked those bays for years, who had no idea their livelihoods had come this close to being gambled away on an investment gone bad. I told Elliot I was ready. Whatever came next, whatever it cost the relationship I had left with my son, I wasn't going to let sentiment stand between the truth and the people that truth was meant to protect. I'd already made that choice once, sitting in Ellen's old chair by the window. Now it was simply time to see it through. Gregory came back 3 days later, once I was strong enough that the doctors were talking about discharge instead of monitoring. He came alone this time, no folder in his hand, and something in his face told me he already sensed. The ground had shifted beneath him, even if he didn't yet know exactly how. I asked Renee, gently, if she'd give us the room, and she squeezed my hand once before she left, a small, silent gesture that told me she already knew what was coming and had made her peace with it. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because I've thought about this conversation many times since, and I've never once wished I'd done it differently. I'd spent months watching, gathering, protecting what needed protecting, and I found, when the moment finally came, that I didn't have any anger left to spend on shouting. What I had instead was something quieter, and I think harder for him to sit through than anger would have been. I told him about the notebook first. I described in plain terms the withdrawals I'd tracked over the past year and a half, the dates, the amounts, the explanations he'd given me that hadn't lined up with what the business actually needed during those months. I watched his face as I spoke, watched the practiced calm he'd worn into every hospital visit start to crack at the edges, watched him open his mouth twice to interrupt before deciding against it both times. Then I told him about the will. I told him it had been rewritten 4 months earlier, that a competency statement protected it from exactly the kind of challenge he might have been considering, and that the temporary power of attorney he'd left on my hospital table would not be signed. Not that day, and not any day after it. I watched something in him go very still. When I said that, the particular stillness of a man realizing the ground he thought he was standing on had already given way beneath him some time ago without his knowing it. I was going to pay it back, he said finally, and his voice had none of the smoothness it usually carried. It was the voice, I realized, of the boy who used to come to me as a child when he'd broken something and hadn't yet worked out how to say so. The investment, Dad. I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know. I thought I had time. I told him I believed that he'd meant to fix it. I still believe that, even now. I don't think my son set out to be a man who takes from his own father, and I think if you'd asked him a year and a half ago whether he was capable of it, he'd have told you no, and meant it honestly. But desperation has a way of moving a person one small step at a time, each one easier to justify than the last, until they look up one day and find themselves somewhere they never intended to go. I told him that understanding how he'd gotten there didn't change what it had cost, or what it had almost cost the people who depended on that business besides the two of us. He asked me, and his voice broke on the question whether I was going to have him arrested. I told him no. I told him that wasn't the kind of justice I was interested in, not for my own son, not for the boy I'd raised and loved, and was still, despite everything, sitting across from as a father even now. What I told him instead was that the business would be restructured the way Elliot and I had planned, that an independent trustee would oversee major decisions going forward, and that he would need to find a way to repay what he'd taken on a schedule Elliot and I would determine together if he wanted any future role in the company at all. I told him that trust, once broken this badly, doesn't come back all at once. It comes back slowly, if it comes back, built the same patient way the business itself had been built, one honest day at a time. He sat with that for a long while, his head in his hands, and when he finally looked up, there were tears on his face that I don't think he'd let himself cry in front of me since he was a boy. He asked if there was any way to fix what he'd done to us, to the family, to the years we'd spent building something together before all of this. I told him I didn't know yet. I told him that was going to be up to him to discover one honest choice at a time, the same way anything worth having ever gets rebuilt. Before he left that day, I asked him to bring me the shop keys from my desk drawer at home, the ones my father had handed down to me. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded, and when he returned the next morning, he set them quietly on the table beside my bed. I didn't give them to him, not that day. Instead, I called Renee back into the room, and in front of both of them, I told her that given everything the business had been through, given the steadiness and honesty she'd shown, when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet, I wanted her to hold on to those keys for now, as a kind of trustee of her own, until Gregory had rebuilt enough trust to earn them back himself. I watched something pass between husband and wife in that moment that I think given time, might turn out to be the beginning of something better than what either of them had been living with before. The weeks after I came home were quieter than any I could remember in a long while, and I mean that as a kind of gift rather than a complaint. Ellen used to tell me that healing doesn't announce itself the way sickness does. It doesn't arrive all at once, dramatic and undeniable. It creeps back in through small, unremarkable moments, and you don't notice how far you've come until you look up one day and realize the heaviness you'd gotten used to carrying isn't sitting on your chest anymore. Renee came by most Sundays, sometimes with Gregory, sometimes without, and little by little, I watched the two of them find their footing again, not as the couple they'd been before, but as something more honest, built on ground that had actually been tested instead of simply assumed. Gregory kept to the schedule Elliot and I had worked out, and he kept to it without complaint, which told me more than any apology could have. He started small, working the floor of the shop again the way he had as a boy, learning the business from the ground up instead of the top down, and there was something in watching him do that which softened a part of me. I hadn't expected to soften so soon. I won't tell you all the trust came back easily. It didn't, and I don't think it should have. But I watched it come back in pieces the way most worthwhile things do, and some Sundays now I catch him glancing at those shop keys, still resting safely in Renee's keeping with something that looks less like resentment and more like patience. Marisol became, in her own quiet way, part of the fabric of my life too, in a manner I never could have predicted the day she sat down beside me in that hospital chair. She came by sometimes on weekends, and I found myself looking forward to those visits more than I let on. This stranger who'd become something like family, simply because she'd chosen on an ordinary Sunday evening not to walk past an old man who needed help. I gave her something I'd been saving, an old set of tools that had belonged to my father, the kind of thing that means nothing to most people and everything to a man who understands what it took to build something with your hands. She cried a little when I gave them to her, and told me nobody had ever trusted her with something that mattered so much. I told her she'd more than earned it, the night she chose to trust an old man's whispered request over every reasonable instinct telling her to walk away. I think about that whisper often now, the one I gave her in that hospital bed with the last clear seconds I had before the sedative took me under. I didn't know in that moment exactly what I was setting into motion. I only knew that something in me, some instinct built over decades of reading people and numbers, and the small tells that separate the truth from a well-rehearsed lie, understood that I needed to protect what mattered before it slipped away from me entirely. I've come to believe that instinct was really just love, wearing the clothes of caution, love for the business my father built, love for the family I still hoped could be saved, even as I protected myself from the parts of it that had gone wrong, love enough to act even when I wasn't certain yet what I was acting against. Some evenings now I sit in Ellen's old chair by the window, the one she used to read in, and I look out at a garden that Renee has slowly started bringing back to life. The same garden Ellen tended for 41 years before her hands gave out the way mine eventually did. I think about how close I came to losing everything I'd spent a lifetime building, not to some stranger or some accident of fate, but to fear and desperation working quietly inside someone I loved. And I think about how the thing that saved it wasn't anger or revenge, or even the careful legal armor Elliot and I had built together, though that armor certainly mattered. What saved it in the end was a kindness I had no right to expect from a stranger, and the courage of a daughter-in-law who finally decided that honesty mattered more than comfort. I don't know what the rest of my years look like yet. I'm 71 now, and I've learned not to plan too far ahead, not because I'm afraid of what's coming, but because I've come to understand that the things worth having in this life rarely arrive on the schedule you set for them. What I do know is that when they wheeled me into that hospital, alone and abandoned by the two people who should have stayed, I whispered 5 words to a stranger because some part of me refused to let go of what I'd built without a fight. And what came back to me in the weeks and months after wasn't just the business, or the will, or the careful legal protections Elliot had helped me put in place. What came back was something I'd been missing since Ellen passed, something I hadn't realized I'd been quietly hoping for every time I sat alone at that dinner table. It was proof, finally, that I hadn't spent my whole life building something for people who would only take it apart the moment I couldn't watch over it anymore. Some of it, at least, had been worth trusting all along.